I was a girl wearing a thing too heavy for me when I first looked at a human and saw a human looking back. You must understand how my people see or do not see. At the court of Arun, we are taught from the cradle that to be seen is a privilege, and that privilege is parceled out by house and by light. The high houses are the lit, the lesser houses are the half-lit, and beneath them, beneath everything, are the unlit, the brought in, the foreign, the ones who came to us on barges with their dead still warm, asking only for a wall and a roof. We took them in. We were proud of taking them in. And then, having taken them in, we arranged never to look at them again. It was not cruelty exactly. Cruelty would have required noticing. It was protocol. An unlit servant in the pale vestry was not addressed by name but by station, thread, ash, hem, and a well-bred Selvin learned to let their gaze pass over such a one the way your eye passes over a chair. You did not hate the chair. You simply did not see it, and you would have been faintly embarrassed to be caught seeing it. The human who mended my coronation was called him, when he was called anything at all. His name was Eli Marsh, though I did not learn that for a long time, and I am ashamed of how long. He was, even by the measure of his own people, an old man, or near it, 50 winters by the human count, which our long-lived houses thought of as barely more than middle weather. He had come to Arun the way they all had, on the barges, after the burning of whatever world had been theirs. He had buried a wife somewhere along that crossing. I know that now. He arrived with a needle case, a pair of shears worn silver-thin at the blades, and hands that had been doing one thing so long they no longer needed his attention to do it. The vestry took him because the vestry always needed hands for the work the master tailors found beneath them. The turning of a frayed cuff, the rehemming of a footman's coat, the patient, invisible labor that keeps a court looking magnificent and is itself never magnificent. He was very good. I want to say that plainly because no one at the time said it at all. He was the best hand in that whole gilded room, and for 11 years not one Selvin in it knew his name. I was 16 in our reckoning, when my grandmother died and left me the realm I did not want. The standing is our oldest rite. A sovereign of Arun is not made by blood alone, but by standing, by appearing before the assembled houses in the hall of standing, robed in the ancestral mantle and being seen by them and being accepted. The mantle is the whole of it. It is called the inheritance, and it is older than the hall it is worn in. It is woven of vellum silk and light thread, a fabric my people no longer know how to make, and across the centuries it has darkened and stiffened and set, the way old things set, until the cloth that once flowed like water lay across it stand like a thing carved out of stone. A new sovereign must wear it, not a copy, not a likeness. The inheritance itself, or there is no standing, and without a standing there is no sovereign, only a frightened child in a too large chair, and the high houses circling, and the realm splitting along its old seams. When they brought it out for me, it tore. I remember the sound more than the sight, a dry, final crack, like a frozen branch, as the mistress of the robes lifted it from its stand, and the whole left shoulder of the inheritance gave way and hung. A wound in the cloth as long as my forearm, the light thread within it snapped and curling, the vellum silk around the tear gone the gray of old bone. The mistress of the robes made a sound I had never heard a Selvin of her rank make. And then the room was very quiet, and everyone in it was looking at the mantle, and no one was looking at me, which by then was the only thing I had ever known. They sent for the masters. I will not give you all their names, because they took such care in those days that I should know theirs and they should never know mine. And there is a small, ungenerous part of me, even now, that likes to leave them in the dark they kept me in. But they came. The guild master of the Lightrites who wove for the high houses, the master Veshirian whose hands had robed 3 sovereigns, the keepers of the old looms, the readers of the old fabric, the alchemists who claimed to know how the light thread had first been set and sung into the silk. They came in their layered robes and their certainty, and they bent over the inheritance, and they failed. They failed grandly. That is the thing about my people that I have only learned to see by being unseen myself. We fail with such magnificence that for a while the failing looks like progress. The Lightrites brought a loom and tried to reweave the torn shoulder whole, thread for thread, and the new light thread would not take the song of the old, and lay across the wound bright and wrong, like a fresh scar that will not match the skin. The alchemists soaked the gray edges in a bath of singing salts to soften them, and the vellum silk drank the salts and stiffened worse, and a second tear opened a handspan below the first. The master Vestiarian, who had robed 3 sovereigns and would not be the one to fail a fourth, took a needle of star steel and forced it through the set cloth by main strength, against the grain, the way a proud hand forces a thing, and the cloth split along the path of his stitches like paper along a fold. 11 days they had, then 10, then 6. The houses had been summoned, the houses were arriving, the date of the standing could no more be moved than the turning of our moons, and the inheritance lay on its stand in worse ruin every dusk than it had at dawn, and the masters argued over it in voices that climbed, and somewhere in the room, I did not see him, none of us saw him, a human in a gray smock turned the hem of a footman's coat and did not say a word. I came down to the pale vestry myself, the night the master Vestiarian broke his needle in the cloth. I should not have. A sovereign-elect does not go down into the working rooms come up to her. But I could not stay in the high chambers another hour with the mistress of the robes weeping into her hands, and the ministers murmuring the word regency a little louder each time they thought I had left the room. I was 16. I wanted, more than I wanted the realm, to be somewhere that no one was looking at the place where I was supposed to be and finding it empty. The vestry at night is the most beautiful room in Arun, and the least regarded. It runs the length of the hall above it, low-ceilinged, hung with the half-made and the under-repair, coats on their forms standing in the dark like a silent assembly, bolts of cloth shelved to the ceiling, the great cutting tables scarred white with 1,000 years of chalk. There is one lamp kept burning all night, at the far end, over the mending bench, because the mending never stops. The court is always fraying somewhere, and someone must always be awake to take it in. The someone that night was the human. He did not see me come in, or if he did he gave no sign, which a well-trained unlit servant would not. To notice a sovereign-elect before being noticed is itself an offense. So for a long moment I stood in the dark of the doorway and watched him work, and he did not know he was being watched, and I understood with a strange lurch that this was exactly the condition I lived in too. We were the watched and the unwatched, he and I, standing at the 2 ends of the same room, and neither of us, in the eyes of that court, was truly seen, he because he was beneath sight, I because I was a vessel for a mantle, and a vessel is looked through to the thing it carries. He had the inheritance on his bench. I do not know to this day who had brought it down to the mending bench, or whether anyone had brought it at all, whether perhaps, after the masters had given it up for the night and gone to their beds to be magnificent at it some more, this one old human had simply walked the length of the room, lifted the ruined thing off its grand stand, and carried it to the only place in the vestry where the light was good and the bench was the right height for close work. That is what I have come to believe. No one had told him to touch it. No one would have dreamed of telling him. He had looked at the thing every master in the realm had failed, and he had carried it to his bench the way you carry a hurt animal to where you can see it, because that is what his hands were for, and he could not be in a room with a wound and not tend it. He was not forcing anything. That was the first thing I noticed, watching him, though it took me years to understand why it mattered. The masters had all been forcing the needle, the thread, the salts, their will. The human was doing the opposite. He had the torn shoulder spread under the lamp, and he was simply looking at it, his head tilted, one finger laid alongside the gray edge of the tear, not pressing, just resting there, the way you rest a hand on a sleeping thing to feel it breathe. Now and then he turned the cloth a little this way, that way, learning which direction the old threads wanted to lie. He was finding the grain. He was asking the cloth how it had been made before he laid a single stitch in it, and the cloth, which had cracked and split for every proud hand that came against it, lay quiet under his. Then he reached into a battered case at his elbow and took out a thimble. It was bone, old bone, yellowed, worn at the crown to a soft shine by a lifetime of being pressed against the back of a finger. A human thing, a small thing, a nothing. He fitted it to his finger the way another man might cross himself before a hard task, an old unconscious gesture, and he threaded a needle with a thread he waxed first across a stub of beeswax, and he leaned into the lamp, and he began, not to reweave the inheritance, not to make it new, not to force the wound shut, but to coax it. To draw the torn edges toward each other a hair at a time, and persuade them to lie together again, working with the grain he had spent an hour learning, the old threads going back where the old threads wanted to go. I watched him set perhaps a dozen stitches before he knew I was there. When he did know, when some sense an old craftsman keeps in the back of his neck told him the dark behind him was occupied, he went very still, and then he set down his needle, and he rose, and he turned, and he bowed in the low, careful way the unlit are taught, his eyes already going to the floor where a servant's eyes belong. And he said, in the trade tongue the barge people learned in order to be useful to us, "Forgive me, bright one. I'll put it back." He thought he would be punished. I understand that now. He had touched the inheritance with his unlit hands. That alone, in the heirloom I was about to inherit, was the kind of offense that ended in a man being put back on a barge. He braced for it the way a man braces for a blow he has felt before, and he reached for the mantle to carry it back to its stand and out of his hands before the offense could be counted against him. "No," I said. It came out of me before I had decided to say it. I was 16, and I had not, in those whole 11 days, said no to a single thing the masters or the ministers or the mistress of the robes had told me. But I said it to the human, and he stopped, his hand above the cloth, and for the first time he raised his eyes. He looked at me, not at the place where the sovereign was supposed to be, at me, at the frightened girl standing in his doorway in her nightclothes with her hair undone, 16 and motherless and outmatched, and he saw me, the way no one in that court had looked at me since my grandmother died, and very few had before. There was no awe in it, and no fear, and no calculation. There was only the plain attention of a man who has spent his life learning to truly look at things in order to mend them, turning that same attention, for one unguarded moment, on a person. "Show me," I said, "how you're doing it, show me." He hesitated. Then, I think because he was too tired and too old and too far from his own dead to keep up the careful unseeing any longer, he simply nodded and pulled the second stool to his bench and waited for me to come and sit. So I learned to sew that night, a little from a human, while the masters of my realm slept. He did not lecture, he showed. He laid my hand on the cloth and made me find the grain myself, my fingers learning what his had learned in an hour, that the inheritance was not stone at all, only very old and very tired, its threads not dead but locked, the way a hand locks when you have not opened it in a long time. "You can't make it be young again," he said, in his rough trade tongue, the only words he gave me all that night that I have carried whole ever since. "But you can be kind to it. Old things mend if you're kind to them. They just won't be hurried." And he waxed a fresh thread and showed me the stitch, and let me set one bad, crooked, human girl stitch in the most sacred cloth in the realm, and he did not correct it where I could see, but I noticed later that he had quietly taken it out when he thought I wasn't watching, and set a true one in its place, so that the inheritance would not carry my clumsiness into the next 1,000 years. He was not protecting the mantle from me. He was protecting me from being remembered for a crooked stitch. It is the same instinct, I think, that had made him take in every fraying cuff in that court without ever once being thanked. He could not be near a thing that needed mending, a coat, a cloth, a girl, and leave it worse than he found it. We talked, a little in the lamplight, or I talked and he listened, which is a kind of mending too. I told him I did not want the realm. I had told no one that. I had not even let myself think it in words, up in the high chambers where the walls had the ears of the high houses. But you can say a thing to a chair, can't you, to a thing the court has agreed is not really there. And so I said it to the human, and the human, who was not a chair, set down his needle and heard it. He did not tell me I was wrong to be afraid. He did not tell me to be brave, or to think of my grandmother, or to remember my duty to the houses, all the things the ministers said. He looked at the mantle on his bench, the torn shoulder I would have to carry, and he said, "It doesn't fit you yet, that's all that is." And he picked up his chalk and his shears, and he said, "Let me look at how it sits on you. Half the reason a thing feels like it's swallowing you is it was made for somebody else's shoulders." And he fitted me. That was the part the masters had never thought to do. They had labored 11 days to make the inheritance whole, and not one of them had thought to ask whether, made whole, it would fit the girl who had to wear it, because the girl was a vessel, and a vessel does not need fitting. You simply pour the rite into it. But Eli Marsh had spent his life making cloth fit people, and to him it was unthinkable to mend a garment and not fit it to the body that would wear it. So he stood me on the cutting table in my nightclothes under the one good lamp, and he draped the half-mended mantle over my shoulders, and he knelt, an old human, knees cracking, kneeling on the cold floor before a girl in her nightclothes, and he began to pin. He took it in at the shoulders, where it had been built for a broader frame than mine. He raised the hem where it had dragged and tangled my feet, the hem that had made me shuffle like an invalid in every rehearsal and made the ministers murmur regency. He found with his chalk all the places the great garment did not yet know my body, and he marked them to be brought in, so that when I walked into the hall of standing I would walk and not shuffle, and the houses would see a sovereign and not a child drowning in her grandmother's robes. And the whole time he knelt and pinned, he talked to me low and steady, not about the realm but about the work this seems pulling. Feel it. That's why your shoulder aches. Lift your arm. There. Now it doesn't, does it? Until somewhere in the middle of it I stopped being afraid. Because it is very hard to be afraid of a future while a kind old man is kneeling in front of you taking such care that your sleeve sits right. "There," he said at last, sitting back on his heels, looking up at me on the table with the pinned mantle hanging true from my shoulders for the first time. "Now it fits. Now it's yours." And I understood that he had mended 2 things that night, and only one of them was the cloth. He worked the 5 days that were left almost without sleep. I know because I came down every night, and every night he was at the bench, the bone thimble on his finger, the lamp drawn close, coaxing the inheritance back toward whole a hair at a time. He never hurried it. They just won't be hurried. The new threads he set went in with the grain, singing the old song because he had taken the time to learn it, so that when he finally laid the last stitch you could not find, even knowing where to look, the line where the wound had been. He had not made it new. He had made it well. There is a difference, and my people, who prize the new and despise the worn, had forgotten it, and a worn old human had remembered it for us. On the last night he fitted me a final time, and took the mantle in at the last seam, and pressed it under a warm iron until the centuries lay smooth across my shoulders, and then he folded it the way you fold something you love, and laid it on the bench, and he bowed to me, lower than before, and said, "It's ready, bright one. You'll do them proud." And he meant the mantle, and he meant me, and he did not for one moment imagine that he himself would be anywhere but here in the dark of the vestry while I stood in the light of the hall, because that was the only arrangement the world had ever offered him. And I went up to be stood, and I let them dress me, and I walked into the hall of standing wearing a mantle no master in the empire could fix, mended by a human no one in the empire would name. I will tell you about the standing, because the standing is where I stopped being the girl this story is about, and started becoming the sovereign who could tell it. The hall was full. Every house of light, lit and half-lit, ranked along the rising tiers, and the air thick with the cold perfume the high houses wear, and at the far end the seat, and the long walk to it that I had practiced shuffling and now, for the first time, did not shuffle because the hem sat right, because my sleeve did not pull, because somewhere an old man had knelt on a cold floor and made the thing fit me. I walked the length of the hall of standing under the eyes of every house in Arun, and the mantle moved with me like water, like it was made for me, and I heard the murmur go through the tears, not the murmur of regency, but the other one, the one I had never heard aimed at me, the small indrawn sound a court makes when it sees something it had not expected to admire. They saw me. For the first time in my life, the high houses of Arun looked at the place where the sovereign was supposed to be and found her there and saw her. And I stood at the seat, robed and whole and seen, and I should have felt only triumph, and instead I felt under the triumph a thing I had no word for yet but have a word for now. I felt the wrongness of being the only one in that hall who knew the truth. They were admiring the inheritance, calling it a marvel restored, already murmuring praise of the master Veshirian who had robed 3 sovereigns and now a 4th, the master Veshirian, who had broken his needle in the cloth and gone to bed. The masters were arrayed in the front tier in their layered robes, taking the credit with grave little bows, and the human who had actually done it was where the human was always made to be, which was nowhere, which was the dark beneath the floor I stood on. I had been unseen my whole life. I knew, better than anyone in that hall, exactly what was being done to him by everyone not looking, and I found that I could not do it. I found that the girl who had been a vessel could not, on the day she finally became a sovereign, perform the first sovereign act of pretending a man was not there. So I broke the rite. You do not speak in the standing until the houses have accepted you. The order of it is older than the hall. I spoke. I raised my hand and the murmur died. And into the great cold silence of every house of Arun waiting for their new sovereign's first words, I said, "Bring up the one who mended it." No one moved. They did not understand me. The master Veshirian half rose, thinking I meant him, thinking I meant to honor him before them all, and I looked at him until he understood that I did not and sat back down, gray in the face. "Not you," I said. "The hands that did it. Bring him up. Bring him into the light. I will not be stood over a man you've put in the dark." They brought him up. They had to go and find him. No one even knew at first who I meant, and there was a terrible interval in which the whole court realized that the sovereign was asking for someone none of them could name. And then a steward who knew the vestry went down and came back leading an old human in a gray smock, blinking in the great lamps of the hall of standing, his bone thimble still on his finger because he had been at his bench, mending some footman's coat, when they came for him, taking in the fraying of a court that had never once, in 11 years, taken in his. He was terrified. Of course he was. He thought he had been found out. He thought this is where they put me back on the barge for touching it. He came up the long aisle between the ranked houses of light with his eyes on the floor and his shoulders braced for the blow, an old man who had buried his wife on a crossing and asked us only for a wall and a roof, certain even now that he had asked too much. I came down from the seat to meet him. A sovereign of Arun does not come down from the seat. I came down. I walked to the foot of the aisle in the mantle his hands had mended, and I stood in front of him so that he had to raise his eyes, and when he raised them, when he looked at me the way he had looked at me in the vestry, the plain seeing look, finding the person and not the station, I said, loud enough for every house in that hall to hear it and carry it home, "This is the hand that mended the inheritance. Every master in the realm failed it. He did not. His name is—" And I stopped because I did not know it. I had sat at his bench 3 nights. I had learned to sew a little from him. I had told him I did not want the realm, and he had heard me, and he had knelt on a cold floor and made the world fit my shoulders. And I did not know his name because I had never once asked it, because even loving him a little I had still, without thinking, treated him the way my whole world had taught me to treat a chair. The shame of it stopped me in my throat in front of the assembled houses of Arun, and the silence stretched, and I understood that the unseeing was not only theirs. It was mine too. It was in me. I had inherited it along with the realm. So I did the second thing a sovereign of Arun does not do. I asked. "What is your name?" I said, quietly now, only to him though the whole hall heard it. "Forgive me, I should have asked you the first night. What is your name?" He looked at me for a long moment, this old human, in the silence of a court that had never asked him anything. And then, I watched it happen, something in his face that had been braced for the blow his whole life let go. All at once, the way the inheritance had let go under his patient hands, a wound finally allowed to close. "Eli," he said, "Eli Marsh, bright one." "Eli Marsh," I said to him and to the hall and to the 1,000 years of sovereigns who would come after me. "Mender of the inheritance, you will be seen in this house for the rest of your days." And then I did the thing that no record of any standing before mine records, the thing the old families of Aaron still argue about, the thing my grandmother would have called a scandal, and that I have never for one moment regretted. I took his hand, his working hand, the one with the bone thimble worn soft at the crown, and I turned to the ranked houses of light, and I held it up, so that every Selvin in that hall had no choice at last but to look directly at a human and see him. It is a small thing to be seen. It costs the seer nothing, and yet I have learned in the long reign that followed that it is the rarest gift my kind has to give, and the one we hoard most jealously, parceling it out by house and by light to everyone except the ones who keep us whole. Eli Marsh lived out his days at the court of Aaron, and he was never again unseen. He kept his bench in the pale vestry. He would not take a higher post when I offered it. He said the mending was the only thing he was any good at, and a man should do the thing he's good at, but the smock he wore in it was now of the sovereign's own color, and when he crossed the great halls the houses inclined their heads to him, awkwardly at first, then naturally, the way you learn to see a thing once you have been made to look at it once. I had him teach me properly in the years that followed. On the bad nights of my reign, the nights the houses circled and the word regency gave way to worse words, I would go down to the vestry and sit at his bench and learn the grain of some old cloth from his hands, and be steadied, because it is very hard to despair while a kind old man is showing you that old things mend if you are only patient and unhurried and willing to ask them how they were made. He is gone now. The thimble is mine. He left it to me, the worn bone thimble, and I keep it on the chain at my throat where another sovereign would keep a jewel. And when the high houses ask why their sovereign wears a servant's tool against her heart, I tell them this whole story, start to finish, exactly as I have told it to you, and I watch them learn to be ashamed, which is the beginning of learning to see. And the inheritance is still mended. You cannot find the wound, even knowing where to look. The shoulder he coaxed back together has outlasted the man who coaxed it, and will robe sovereigns long after I too am only a name in the right. And at every standing now, by a law I made and signed with my own hand, the mender of the court is brought up into the light before the sovereign is stood, and named and seen, so that no hand that keeps Aaron whole is ever again left in the dark. We made that law because of a human no one would look at, who looked at me when I was a frightened girl drowning in a dead woman's robes and saw me, and knelt down on a cold floor, and with a needle and a wax thread and an old bone thimble, mended the thing my whole magnificent empire had failed, and made me, who had never once in my life been truly seen, visible at last. His name was Eli Marsh. I am telling you so that you will know it. I should have asked him the first night.